You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 86. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm so excited to have you here this week. As you may have guessed from the title of this podcast episode, this is the first part in a 4-part series where I am going to talk to you about executive function and time management and the relationship between those two things. I am breaking it into a 4-part series because I would like to go somewhat in depth for each of the topics. And I feel like if I were to do them all at once, it would be too long and too overwhelming. And when I break it up this way, it will help you track each of the different stages that I'm going to be talking about in this series of podcast episodes. So to give you a little bit of background about why I'm doing this, you may have heard me talk about this on the podcast before or seen it in a LinkedIn post I made late last year. And I have been doing additional training as a coach to learn more about ADHD coaching. The reason being that it's an area that is very interesting to me for a number of reasons, including that I have lawyers who reach out to me who tell me that they have ADHD, and I wanted to be able to have more tools in my toolkit so that I could serve them better. And what I've learned through my own research into ADHD, my own research into executive function, is that there are a number of tools that are helpful whether or not you have ADHD when it comes to your executive function. And if I look at executive function the way that I like to look at it, it's taking a step back and looking at the way that you think. It's looking at your brain, how your brain works, and taking your executive function and breaking it down into a number of discrete skills, which if you look at it from the big picture, may be overwhelming. You might not know where to start, but if you look at each skill individually, then you can understand what it is and how you can leverage where you're strong and build up where you're weak. So if I were to explain what executive function is for any of you for whom this is not a term that you're super familiar with, executive function is defined, and here I take the definition from the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, as a group of complex mental processes and cognitive abilities, such as working memory, impulse inhibition, and reasoning, that control the skills such as organizing tasks, remembering details, managing time, and solving problems that are required for goal-directed behavior. And as a lawyer, your ability to use your executive functioning is huge in the work that you do, not only for the substantive work that you do, but also for the way that you manage your practice. And I get calls from lawyers, I get called from law firms to help lawyers with their practice management. And a big part of this, in my experience, is your ability to really understand and leverage your executive functioning skills. Another way to look at your executive functioning skills is to think about your brain and the different parts of it physiologically. And to break it into very basic images, there's the front of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the more evolved thinking. It's the more evolved part of your brain. It's where the executive functions are basically housed, so that planning, organization, impulse control, emotional regulation, all of that is found in the more sophisticated or advanced part of your brain. And you compare that to the more primitive, perhaps, part of your brain, which is the lower part of your brain, which is more of that emotional response, the instincts. It's that sort of deeper, older part of your brain. And so what we're focused on here is how do we leverage the more evolved systems to have a better practice, to have a more controlled practice, to make things less stressful, more organized. So the way we're going to do this is I've broken down a series of podcast episodes into 4 different categories. My goal with these podcast episodes is, number 1, to help you understand what the executive functions are and how they are reflected in your practice. And the second objective is to give you some strategies to leverage your executive function. So the 4 different stages that we're going to cover are, number 1, before you get started. So before you get started on any particular goal or project, what do you need to do to set yourself up for success? And that is the topic of today's podcast episode. The second part of this series will be getting started. That really is focusing on task initiation and overcoming procrastination, which I know is something that a lot of us struggle with. And so I'll be giving you a breakdown of what is causing that and how you can help yourself overcome that. The third part of the series is going to be staying focused. So that is really staying on task. It is dealing with distractions, which is highly relevant to lawyers, especially when you have those really intense drafting sessions, whether you're drafting contracts, whether you're drafting written argument, where you're sitting and you're staying focused for long periods of time and you're trying to figure out how best to do that. And then finally, the 4th step will be finishing what you start. So that requires that you stay motivated. It requires that you complete the task that you've set for yourself. And so the idea here is to look at each of these 4 phases and to look at the executive functions that are involved at each stage and to offer tools and strategies in relation to each. So what you can imagine is, when the series is done, you'll have these 4 sections. Hopefully each of these will be digestible. My goal is to make them reasonably concise so that they're not overwhelming, so that there's not too much information for you to actually take action in respect of each of these categories. So for today, we are going to talk about what you need to do before you begin a task or embark on a goal or a project to set yourself up for success. Now, before I dive in, I wanted to invite you to do one more thing. And that is, as I go through today's podcast episode and get into the discussion, I invite you to think about yourself and where you see yourself as being particularly strong. What you are going to find is that there are executive functioning skills where you are naturally very strong. And chances are, because you're naturally strong, you've further developed those skills. And there may be others where you are not as strong. And so I'd like you to identify with your strengths and areas where you may not feel as strong. And with that information, you will then know where you might need additional support, where you can couple your strengths with maybe a weakness to get the result that you want. You might also think about how leveraging your strengths will improve your practice, and also who do you need, what do you need in your practice, whether it's support in terms of team members, whether it's additional support in terms of structures and strategies that you use to bolster areas where you're not quite as strong. So really take this material and apply it to yourself as we go through the various podcast episodes. So going back to today's topic, setting yourself up for success, how do I see this as an area that requires some work in practices? I think lawyers can have struggles. They may lose time. They may miss things because of a lack of planning and organization. Yes, sometimes there is a lack of planning and organization. Now, the reason that this happens isn't through any moral failing or shortcoming. What happens is sometimes you are in such a rush to get the job done that you may not be able to make time for planning, or you feel like you don't have time to plan and strategize and organize. You may not see the value in planning. I know for myself, planning is something that I love. I enjoy it. I think it's probably one of my stronger skills in terms of my executive function portfolio, if you will. And so for me, planning is something that I engage in, potentially even to a fault. Sometimes I find I'm so busy planning, I don't execute as early as I could. But I know for some of you out there, planning is just not something that you're all that interested in doing. You'd much rather just dive in. And so when you do that, you might miss out on opportunities to set yourself up for greater success than just diving in. Sometimes you don't necessarily jump into that planning and organizing stage because it is not recognized, it's not rewarded, it may not be billable. So imagine, this is something that comes up quite a bit in my practice, is when a lawyer is really looking to up-level their time management practices, we are often starting at the place of instilling within the weekly calendar time to actually plan. And some of this time, if not all of this time, is not billable, right? If you're sitting down and you're literally just thinking about your week, when you're going to have a meeting with your assistant to check in, make sure things are on track, whether it's sitting down with yourself for an hour on Monday morning or on Sunday afternoon to plan out what's going to happen during the week, this might not be time that you can capture. And so in your mind's eye, it may not be as valuable as the time that you spend directly billing on a billable file matter. Some of the time will be billable if what you are planning is something that is directly related to a file, whether you're planning for a closing, whether you're planning how you're going to structure an argument or a large litigation mandate. That time probably is billable. You probably are able to capture it. You know, you are exercising your discretion. I don't want to tell you something that may not be the case. So you need to use your judgment as a lawyer to decide whether it's billable or not. But chances are, if what you're doing is planning and organizing in relation to a specific billable mandate, then it may be more recognized. But going back to why sometimes planning and organization simply isn't being made a priority is that relative to what else is going on, it just doesn't seem as important. So what you may try to do is jump straight in and build as you go. And there are times when that is going to be the best strategy. But if that's your default, I would invite you to think about what it would be like for you if you did start to incorporate this planning phase. And an analogy that I would like to use, because I think it's really easily relatable, is the act of assembling IKEA furniture. And if you've ever brought home one of those flat-packed cardboard containers, maybe there's multiple containers, and you open into that container and there's a set of instructions, there's multiple panels, there's usually a few bags that contain some little screws and little wooden chips that you have to kind of punch into each side of the furniture that you're building, you'll know that there's a process to be followed. Now, when I build IKEA furniture, what I like to do, and maybe this is not what you do, but this is what I like to do, is I like to set everything up ahead of time. I like to lay a towel or something on the ground. Maybe it's a blanket, because that's what the picture tells me that I should do. I like to get the tools that I need. I like to take all the different screws and nails or whatever they are, and I put them into different containers so that kind of they're all grouped into like, and it makes it easier for me to then execute when I go to do the job. Now, I know other people who like to assemble IKEA furniture by tearing open the box, grabbing the instruction manual, and just building as they go. And I myself don't find that as comfortable. The reason being is that I think once you approach it that way, then it takes longer sometimes to find the screws or the nubs or the nails that you're looking for. You may not have all the required pieces that you actually need. It may require, God forbid, a trip back to IKEA to make sure that you've got everything. You may not have all the tools that you need. You may not have the hammer and the Allen key and the weird little soft rubbery hammer thing that you might need to kind of push the pieces together. So it seems like I'm going a little bit off track with this IKEA analogy, but what I'm inviting you to think about is when you have your mandate, your goal, your project, your calendar, and you do it on the fly, you miss out on the opportunity to get all of the ingredients together and be organized for when the time comes for execution. So if you are jumping straight in, you're not doing that advanced planning, you may find that you run into certain challenges. You might miss things, right? If you're putting together a strategy on a file, whether it's a closing, whether it's a litigation mandate, whether it's a research project, whether it's an email to a client, you may find that if you jump in, you may miss things, you may miss steps, you might not plan efficiently. You might find that you jump into the doing and realize 5 steps in that there was a step that you needed to do earlier, or that if you had done it earlier, you would already have that task underway and it would be kind of bubbling on the back burner and ready for you to access at the time that you needed it most. Now, if you are working on a project that requires multiple people to be involved, you may find that you, without adequate or proper planning in advance, you don't get other people involved at a very early stage. And so by the time you get to the point of delegating instructions, the others do not have as much time as they would like or need to do an adequate job. And chances are you've been at the receiving end of this, where somebody else maybe left things to the last minute. Maybe it was a colleague, maybe it was a client. It may not have been through any lack of planning on their part. Maybe it was. I know when I used to practice as a litigator, sometimes I would receive files from a client that were very close to the limitation period expiring, which usually meant a pretty sweaty hustle to get a claim together and filed in time so that the client didn't lose their right to their action. And what we always experienced, we being me and the team that I was working with, is that those files typically weren't less expensive, certainly, than files where we had the materials in advance. And it was messier, it was more stressful. We weren't necessarily filing with all the information that we would have liked to have had. So there was no real upside to having the claim not filed ahead of time. And if you're on the other side of that, then you know what that experience is like relative to when you have adequate time to plan. So going back to here, this example, and some of the drawbacks that you may experience if you don't do that adequate planning ahead of time, is that the people that are there to help you may not be able to support you in the way that you would like them to support you because they simply don't have time. It may also be that you have unclear goals. If you jump right in without knowing exactly where your destination is, then you might find yourself on a circuitous route to get from point A to point B. I know this can happen sometimes when you're driving, right? If you've got your destination clearly in focus, maybe you access your GPS, maybe you've got a map. I'm old school, so I like to use maps. Yes, I know. At least instructions. Then you have a much clearer direction. You know in advance where you're going and how you're going to get there. If you just jump into the car and say, I'm going to head south, it might take you a little bit longer to get there because you may not, number one, know exactly where you're headed, or number two, what route you want to take to get there. You may also find that you lose track of things. So if you don't have clear planning in place, you might find that you're not even sure, especially if it's a big task, where you're at when you are processing or proceeding through that task. What was done, what wasn't done. If you're relying on your working memory to keep track of all those things, you may lose track. So what ends up happening here is that you may feel like the project that you're working on, your practice, your calendar, whatever it is that you're focused on, is done in a way that is much more reactive versus proactive. You may find that it's not necessarily efficient, that you're losing time, you're having to redo things, you're making mistakes that you then have to go back and correct. And overall, the whole process ends up being more stressful than it needs to be. So the solution that I'm offering today is to think about how you can leverage your executive function to plan at the stage before even acting. And in this planning stage, this pre-work stage, before you initiate action, there are 3 areas of executive function that I'm going to talk about today that I would invite you to consider. Number 1 is planning and prioritization. Number 2 is organization. And number 3 is working memory. So when it comes to the first one, planning and prioritization, I'm going to offer you a definition. And I'm taking this definition from a book. It is called The Smart But Scattered Guide to Success: How to Use Your Brain's Executive Skills to Keep Up, Stay Calm, and Get Organized at Work and at Home. It's written by Peg Dawson and Richard Gere. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's Guare. This is a handbook that was recommended to me by a friend. This title, Smart But Scattered, I think is perfect. I think it describes so many people. And the reason that I love this book, the reason why I've been recommending it, is because it breaks down the executive functions into, I think it's 12 different categories. And for each of them, they offer an explanation of how it's based neurologically within your brain. They give examples and they give strategies that you can use to help strengthen, leverage, support yourself in relation to each of these categories. So if this is a topic that resonates with you, I think it's an excellent resource to have. And for the purpose of today's podcast, I am going to borrow some definitions that they use in that book because I find them to be really helpful. One thing that I forgot to mention when it comes to executive functioning is that when you look at executive function skills, depending on the source, the psychologist, the textbook, the article, whatever it is that you're reading or listening to that is describing executive function, there may be a different number of categories depending on who it is. So I think the numbers that I've seen have been anywhere from maybe 6 to 12 different types of functioning skills. And so you'll just want to be mindful of that there can be different views on what constitutes an executive functioning skill. So in this particular podcast episode, and I expect for the ones that follow, I'm using the categories as described in this particular book. So the first, planning and prioritization, is defined as the ability to create a roadmap to reach a goal or complete a task. It also involves being able to make decisions about what's important to focus on and what's not important. So I'm going to talk about it in two different ways. Number one is the planning, and number two is the prioritization. So number one, I'd invite you to think about what tasks you have, what goals you have. I'd invite you to think about how you're planning your days, how you're structuring your calendar, and to imagine what that experience is like when you're focused specifically on planning first and prioritization second. So what does planning mean? Well, planning really involves sitting down and imagining what it is you're trying to do. Maybe you're trying to draft an email to a client. Maybe you're trying to set a schedule for a large litigation mandate. Maybe you're planning for a closing. So get that goal in mind for yourself. Then I invite you to think about what the steps are that are required of you. And I always encourage people to write things down, whether it's by hand, whether it's typing it out into a list. Then I want you to think about who you are going to need to help you. I'm going to invite you to forecast what challenges you might have and then plan for them. I'm going to invite you to plan and look for efficiencies. So when you're thinking about how you want to structure the goal, the project, your calendar, how can you organize it in a way that is most efficient? And we'll get to more of this too when we get into the organization section. I invite you to look at timelines. How long is it going to take for each of the steps that is required in your plan? I'd invite you to think about what tools you need, right? Going back to that IKEA analogy, have you got all the tools you need? Or are you going to find yourself mid-task and then you're going to have to keep getting up and running and grabbing something else? Whether it's, if you're doing research, maybe it's getting some of the texts that you need handy, having them on your desk. It may also require, and this I advocate so strongly, is creating a physical representation for what it is that you are planning, whether that is a list, whether it's having a whiteboard where you can write down your notes, whether it's sticky tabs that you're putting on your computer or on a piece of paper, whether you're using them to, you're shuffling them around, getting the planning part ready. If you've got big projects, for example, you may have more sophisticated planning software. So what I'm inviting you to think about here is when you sit down to do a task before you even get started is to create your plan. And if you're looking for more suggestions, I'm going to refer you back to a couple of podcast episodes that I've recorded in the past. Number one is episode number 22. And that's where I really get into planning, not just for short term, but also for long-term objectives. And I'd invite you to think about planning regardless of the size of the task. I find planning for small tasks can be very, very helpful, as well as planning for larger tasks. The other episode that I recommend here is episode number 6, which is all about using a great goal framework to accomplish your goals. So again, that is going to prompt you to consider different aspects of your goal and to put them into a framework that will ultimately help you achieve that goal. So going back to this first executive function, which is planning and prioritization, this is what I recommend in terms of planning. The second is to look at prioritization. And I've talked about setting priorities in the podcast before. I think a tool that is often referred to that is helpful here is the Eisenhower matrix. That's where you plan based on importance and urgency. And what you want to think about here when you look at a task is it important and urgent, in which case it's probably right at the top. If it's important but not urgent, are you scheduling time on your calendar to do this task? Because if it's important but not urgent, chances are it's one of those tasks that's getting pushed off indefinitely. And as I say this, I'm thinking of tasks where I've done this, and I imagine you can also think in your mind's eye about tasks that you know are important, but because they may lack urgency, aren't necessarily the tasks that you're getting to right away. Of course, then there are the tasks that are not important but urgent. So you know those tasks. You may have individuals in your life who are perhaps known to you for coming to you with tasks that are urgent but not necessarily important. And you may find strategies to deal with those. And then there are the tasks that are, of course, not important and not urgent that somehow find their way to the top of your to-do list. We'll probably talk about those when we talk about procrastination, because that type of task is something that can often find its way to the top of the priority list when it seems more palatable than doing the task that you know that you need to do, but that you don't want to get started on. So I'm foreshadowing here a little bit, but when it comes to prioritization, the idea here is to give yourself a framework to decide what you're going to do first. A couple of other tools I like to use and that I certainly used as a lawyer were looking at timelines. And in your practice, you may find that there are certain things that are timeline driven. If you're a litigator, it may be limitation periods, application filing deadlines. It may be deadlines on a litigation file that are governed by the rules of court, or if you're in an arbitration or other type of proceeding, there are deadlines that you must adhere to. And so that may be a really good way for you to be planning some of the priorities that you have that are work related. You may also look at sequencing. So again, I'm thinking about litigation mandates. If, for example, you know you need to file an application and you have an affidavit in support of it, you may have an argument that you're filing, you may have other materials that you're filing. It's always great to look at what is required and then work your way backwards and do those items that have the longest timelines, because they involve other people, because there's a lot of research that needs to be done, because there's last minute formatting that you know is going to be required. Whatever it is that is required, I invite you to think about it from that backwards planning perspective and then schedule your tasks accordingly, prioritize your tasks accordingly, get help as early as possible in alignment with those goals. So looking back at this first step, we're looking at tools to plan, we're looking at tools to prioritize. And when you do these things, you are already setting yourself up for greater success because you have now set up that roadmap for the task ahead. Now, the second executive function that I invite you to think about is organization. And organization is defined as the ability to create and maintain systems to keep track of information or materials. I'm going to read that again. It is the ability to create and maintain systems to keep track of information or materials. Now, you may know whether or not you're an organized person by looking at your desk around you. It may be that it's cluttered. There may be unopened mail. There may be unopened emails. There may be decisions that you need to make that haven't yet been made. Now, organization, I think you can have a workspace that to others may not look organized, but it is organized. As long as you understand in your own mind how things are set up, how they are structured, that can be organized as long as it's a system that works for you. Another key component to organization is clutter and decluttering. And you may find that clutter is actually costing you time. If you think about your closet, for example, or a cupboard or a drawer, or maybe even in your inbox, there are emails that are cluttering up your inbox. The more you have that is cluttering, more time you're inevitably going to waste because you're going to have to remake decisions to ignore those things every time that you see them. Or you may have to sift through them to find the thing that you are looking for. Or you may need to attend to them. The image that comes to mind to me is when you have a lot of trinkets in your house, and if you go to dust them, it's like you're dusting all these trinkets. You may not even like those trinkets, and yet you're spending time caring for them. So here, what I'd invite you to think about is in relation to the goals that you have in terms of your priorities, your objectives, is there clutter there that is potentially costing you time and holding you back? So some suggestions here in terms of organization is to think about how you are organizing your physical space and materials. So you might think about your office space. Is it set up in a way that is helping you advance your goals? Have you given physical space priority to the files that you want to work on immediately? Do you have a place where you can store files that are not immediately being worked on? What does that look like? When you open a file, do you have a certain standard way of doing it? When you look at your calendar, how are you organizing your time? Is it a neat and precise and effective way of using your time? Or do you find that your calendar has lots of that clutter inside of it? And if it does have clutter, what can you do about it? When you look at how you're organizing your meetings, are you doing it in a way that is effective and strategic? I have spoken a lot about time management before. You can go back to episode 2 where I share a number of strategies. And one of them is really being organized about how you use your time in relation to your energy. So this is going a little bit off topic, but if you know, for example, that you are more alert in the morning and less so in the afternoons, you may want to strategically schedule your meetings in the afternoon because that might be more convenient for you. You might find it's a lot easier to be engaged and focused in a meeting in the afternoon, whereas trying to write that really dense brief or legal argument in the afternoon is going to require a different level of thinking that you're more capable of in the morning. So what I'm suggesting here is that you organize the tasks on your to-do list. You organize your files. You organize your time in a way that is most conducive to you achieving the goals that you have in a way that is efficient and organized and fluid. You may also want to delete, right? Going back to that idea of decluttering, what is currently on your desk that you would like to say goodbye to, and to then remove those things from your day. Other things you might start looking at are systems and routines that can help you to stay on track, that allow you to have efficiency. So if you have files that look very similar to each other, are there systems that you can create to deal with them in a methodical way? Or are you custom creating each one? And maybe your practice is such that custom creating is what makes the most sense for you. But if there's ways that you can streamline and create systems, then I encourage you to think about what those are and then either create those systems or have somebody else do that for you. So when it comes to organization, I have a couple of podcast episodes that I will refer you to. Number 1 is a podcast episode that I recorded. It's episode number 25. And it's an episode I recorded with a friend of mine. She's amazing. She's a professional organizer. Her name is Mylène Morancy. And we talk about decluttering and designing a workspace. And so I'd invite you to listen to that episode. I'd also invite you to go back to an episode I recorded about decluttering. It's episode number 10. And then finally, there's another podcast episode I recorded. It's episode 36. And it's all about creating systems and checklists that save time. So again, just to recap where we're at in terms of executive function and how to leverage your executive function to save time and achieve your goals. Number 1, we have planning and prioritization. Number 2, we're looking at organization. So again, this is an executive functioning skill. I'd invite you to think about how strong you are in terms of organization. If it's something that you're great at, you can leverage it. If it's an area where you can struggle, you might find ways to get support. Maybe your assistant is really good at that. You can invite your assistant to help you with that. Maybe you have teammates that are really good at that. But again, it's just gaining awareness of how strong you are in a particular area and then developing strategies to support yourself. Now, I mentioned checklists a moment ago, and that leads us nicely to the third executive function that we're going to talk about today, and that is working memory. And working memory is defined as the ability to hold information in memory while performing complex tasks. It incorporates the ability to draw on past learning or experience to apply to the situation at hand or to project into the future. So you might think about your working memory and how you are engaging it in relation to particular tasks. So, for example, if you are writing an opinion to a client, you may be leaning on or using law, knowledge of substantive law that you either researched and learned recently or something that you know based on your previous experience as a lawyer. You are bearing in mind the facts that you know that your client has relayed to you in relation to a specific situation that they are seeking your advice on. You are actively writing. Perhaps it's an email, perhaps it's an opinion letter. And so you're consciously aware of where you are in relation to your task. Are you at the beginning of that email? Are you in the middle of it? Are you at the end? All of this is engaging your working memory. And A completely unrelated example. This is something that my husband and I joke about. We are in our mid-40s. This idea that as you get older, sometimes your memory gets a little bit less sharp, and you might find yourself walking into the kitchen and then wondering why you walked in there in the first place. I think that's really a case where your working memory has had a little bit of a lapse. So in relation to your work, you might ask yourself how you can take the pressure off your working memory. And I've got a number of ideas to help you do that. The number one strategy here is to write it down. Using a checklist to set out what it is that you need to do, whether there are certain things that you need to remember that you've already done or things that you want to do going forward. When I used to practice law and I would get a large research assignment, I would create a checklist, number one, in advance of what I was doing so that I knew what sources I was looking at, where I wanted to go, the different steps that were involved in the work product that I was creating. And I would also keep a checklist of where I had been because I couldn't always remember if I was doing a multi-day research task. Have I looked here? Have I read this case? Have I done that? And so you may want to reduce to writing the various stages that you have gone through in relation to your tasks so that you don't forget and so that you know what you have ahead of you. So this is a wonderful way of taking something out of your working memory, putting it on paper, and now you free up your space mentally to do better things with your brain. And there was a wonderful example or expression that I heard another coach use. I wish I could remember who. And they said, you don't want to be using your brain, your beautiful prefrontal cortex, as a storage locker, right? You don't want to be just dumping everything in the kitchen sink into your brain and then trying to remember it. I'd prefer that you imagine your brain as this beautiful curated museum where you just want to have in there the complex, beautiful problems you're trying to solve. The rest of it can go on a to-do list or a checklist or a sheet of paper, or you can delegate it to somebody else. Free up that space to use it for what it was designed for, which is this higher level thinking. That's really what you're excellent at. That's really where you want to be focusing your energy. So, number one, find a way to write it down, get it out of your brain. Another strategy that you might use is to use physical cues. And this goes back to organization. You might organize your workspace in a way that you have physical cues and reminders of what it is that you want to do. An analogy is perhaps if you're trying to develop a workout routine where you go for a walk or a run in the morning, you might place your runners right next to your bed. Well, you might do the same, metaphorically speaking, in your office. You might have the file that you're working on immediately to your left on your desk, right by your computer where you can access it. You might have your cases organized from most important to least important. You might have, if you're working on a closing, for example, you might have that checklist handy and you're able to see where you're at any given time. These physical reminders are especially helpful if you find that you get lost in tasks that maybe you really struggle with your working memory. And some clues that you may struggle with your working memory is, do people describe you as scatterbrained? Do you find sometimes that you make careless mistakes? Do you find that you lose things or forget where you're at in relation to a specific project? So these are challenges for you. Then I highly encourage you to think about your working memory, think about this executive function and how you can bolster it. A third strategy I offer here is routines. So the more you can make things routine, the less you're relying on your conscious memory to execute, remember, to do things. So if you've got patterns or habits, maybe it's every time a client reaches out with a new file, there's a certain routine that you follow. The more you can create routines in your practice, the better. These routines, I would also invite you to consider in your personal life. The more you can standardize simple things like meal planning or what you're wearing to the office or how you structure your days, the more routine you have, the less you're relying on your active working memory to create that structure every day based on, starting from scratch. It helps if you have some routines in place. So just to recap, in terms of the different functions that we've talked about today to help set you up for success. So these are the functions you want to think about, the skills you want to exercise before you get started on a project or a goal or before you dive into your calendar. Number one, that planning and prioritization. Number 2, organization. And number 3, working memory. And if any of these resonate with you, you can look them up and do some additional research and learn more about these skills and learn more strategies. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out to me. I would love to help you with this. And I always love when lawyers reach out to me ahead of time before this becomes a problem in their practice so that we can brainstorm together so that we can help set you up for success. The reason that this will work is when you invest the time upfront to create a plan, you are going to save time in execution. You are going to be able to forecast the problems and deal with them ahead of time. You'll get help enlisted sooner rather than later. You're going to have less of that stress and reactivity in your practice. It's not going to be as messy. You're less likely to miss things. And perhaps most impactful from a process standpoint is I find the way that you start a project has so much influence over how you finish that project. So if you start on a path of success where you set it up ahead of time and you're organized and you're thoughtful and you know the stages ahead, it just sets the tone. And you can contrast that with days where you may have gotten up on the wrong side of the bed, where maybe you slept through your alarm and then you missed your bus to work, or you missed your train to work, or you arrived late for a meeting and the day just seemed to snowball after that. It just got worse and worse and worse. This is the opposite. You're really just setting yourself up for success, for a good day, for a well-run project, and it just continues to build on itself. So some of the skills you'll need in order to execute in this way is you're going to need to focus on leveraging your executive function. Again, it's planning and prioritizing the tasks that are ahead of you. It's being organized. It's organizing your physical space. It's organizing your calendar. It's organizing your mind, right? What do you want to be thinking about and how do you want to be thinking about this project? And finally, it's leveraging your working memory. It's taking the pressure off yourself to remember everything and to put it somewhere. Maybe it's on paper, maybe it's a routine, maybe it's physical cues, maybe it's setting up a physical cue so that you can remember it. And by the way, speaking of working memory, I have my notes. And so I was just able to go back and to revisit the notes that I had in relation to working memory. So this is why you want to do this. It just helps you out so much. You're going to also want to customize your strategy to your own individual needs based on where you're stronger and based on where you're weaker. And finally, you need to be willing to take the time to invest that time up front to save time in the future. And going back to one of the initial challenges I mentioned, if you have a really busy practice, you might feel like the best first step is just to dive in. But sometimes investing that time up front, and it doesn't need to be long. It might just be 5 minutes to sit down and write a checklist for yourself. Maybe it's longer than that. If you're planning out your week, you might give yourself more time. I like to give myself a half an hour to an hour every week where I just sit down and plan. And every day I like to look at the tasks on my list and then strategize and prioritize accordingly. So for all of you, I would invite you to think about these executive functioning skills in relation to the projects that you have at hand so that you can set yourself up for success. And when you do this, you will create the results that you want. Chances are you'll do it in less time and with less stress. So, my dear, dear friend, that is part 1 of our 4-part series. The next chapter is going to be task initiation. So that's once you've got your plan in place, it's getting started. And I know for a lot of you, myself included, that task initiation can be challenging. So we're going to dive into what that looks like at the executive function level and how you can tackle that, how you can leverage your executive function to get started. And I'd love to say here, because I think it applies here too, awareness is really key. Now that you have awareness of the executive skills that we talked about today, that's going to help you as you plan and prepare for your projects going forward. So, my dear, dear friend, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you are enjoying this podcast, I really would love it if you would rate and review this podcast wherever it is that you download podcasts. It helps other people find this podcast, so I would really appreciate it. And of course, if you would like additional support in relation to anything that we talk about in this podcast, please feel free to reach out to me, whether it is by email, whether it's on LinkedIn, whatever is most comfortable for you. So with that, I wish you a beautiful week with lots of planning and organization, and I cannot wait to connect with you again in the second installment of this series. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.